Throughout history, the archetype of the suffering messianic figure has emerged as a poignant and unsettling motif. The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth stands as the most emblematic example of this archetype, yet the echoes of the Passion narrative reverberate far beyond its first-century origins. In particular, the stories of Black messianic figures, those who dared to challenge oppressive systems, inspire hope among the marginalized, and assert their divine right to justice, carry chilling parallels to this narrative of persecution, betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice. These figures, embodying spiritual, cultural, and political defiance, have often found themselves condemned by the very societies they sought to redeem, crucified figuratively or literally by forces of imperialism, racism, and systemic oppression. The intersection of Blackness and messianic leadership reveals a deep-rooted fear of liberation movements led by those who defy racial hierarchies. Whether in Africa, the Americas, or the broader diaspora, the fate of these figures reflects a disturbing continuity. The systems of power they opposed responded with strategies of vilification, dehumanization, and often violent eradication. These patterns, disturbingly reminiscent of the crucifixion narrative, highlight not only the enduring resonance of such martyrdom, but also the universality of the struggle for justice against overwhelming odds. From the days of colonial conquest, Black leaders who embraced messianic roles were often viewed as existential threats to the social order. In many cases, these individuals did not merely position themselves as political revolutionaries, but as divinely appointed saviors. This theological framing amplified their threat in the eyes of colonial and imperial powers, as it drew upon deeply rooted spiritual traditions to galvanize followers into action. In 19th-century Jamaica, the figure of Paul Bogle looms large. Bogle, a Baptist preacher, combined Christian teachings with a fierce critique of colonial rule, particularly the exploitation of freed slaves following the abolition of slavery. His leadership during the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865 drew heavily on the idea of divine justice, casting his uprising as both a political and spiritual confrontation. Bogle's execution by hanging, though it evoked the imagery of crucifixion, served as a stark warning to others who might seek to challenge the colonial order. His death mirrored the Passion narrative in that it sought to extinguish not only the man but the movement he represented. A similar tale unfolds with Santewa, the Ashanti Queen Mother who led her people against British colonizers in Ghana during the War of the Golden Stool, 1900. Although she was not physically crucified, her eventual capture and exile symbolized the crucifixion of an idea, the assertion of African sovereignty against foreign domination. Santewa's role as a spiritual and political leader further reinforces the messianic archetype. Her followers revered her as the embodiment of resistance and hope. The transatlantic slave trade and the plantation economies of the Americas provided fertile ground for the emergence of Black messianic figures. Enslaved Africans brought with them rich spiritual traditions that often fused with Christianity to create new, syncretic forms of worship. These traditions gave rise to leaders who drew on both African and Christian symbols to articulate visions of liberation. One such figure was Nat Turner, whose 1831 rebellion in Virginia stands as one of the most significant slave uprisings in American history. Turner, a deeply religious man, believed he was chosen by God to lead his people out of bondage. His visions and sermons inspired an insurrection that struck terror into the hearts of slaveholders across the South. In the aftermath, Turner was captured, tried, and hanged, a death that bore the hallmarks of crucifixion in its public spectacle and its intent to humiliate and terrify. Like the Passion narrative, Turner's story is one of betrayal, sacrifice, and an enduring legacy that transcends his death. Similar echoes can be found in the story of Zumbi dos Palmares, the leader of a 17th-century Maroon community in Brazil. Zumbi's resistance to Portuguese colonizers and slaveholders positioned him as a messianic figure among escaped slaves and other marginalized groups. His eventual capture and execution, his head was displayed as a warning to others, further reinforces the parallel to crucifixion, both in its brutality and in its symbolic intent to crush the spirit of resistance. Central to the Passion narrative is the theme of betrayal, a motif that recurs in the stories of Black messianic figures. Just as Judas's betrayal of Jesus underscores the fragility of human loyalty. Many black leaders were undone by those within their own ranks or communities. Betrayal often served as a tool for colonial powers, who exploited divisions among the oppressed to maintain control. In the case of Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary leader, betrayal came in the form of false promises. Louverture's capture by French forces, under the pretense of negotiations, led to his imprisonment and eventual death in exile. While he was not physically crucified, his story embodies the spiritual and political dimensions of the Passion narrative, a leader's sacrifice for the redemption of his people, only to have his legacy endure as a symbol of freedom and resistance. The sacrifice of these leaders often carried profound spiritual significance for their followers. In many cases, their deaths were not seen as defeats, but as transformative acts that validated their divine missions. This perspective echoes the Christian theology of the crucifixion, where Jesus' death is framed as a necessary step toward redemption. The crucifixion of black messianic figures is not confined to the distant past. In the 20th century, leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X embodied aspects of the messianic archetype. Both men combined spiritual and political leadership, challenging systemic racism while articulating visions of justice that drew heavily on religious symbolism. Their assassinations, like the crucifixions of earlier figures, were acts of public spectacle intended to silence dissent. King's invocation of Christian imagery, particularly in his final speeches, reinforces the parallel to the Passion narrative. His famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, delivered the day before his assassination, carries an almost prophetic tone, suggesting he understood the inevitability of his fate. In Malcolm X's case, his evolution from militant rhetoric to a more inclusive vision of human rights mark him as a threat to multiple power structures, sealing his fate as a martyr. In contemporary times, the deaths of figures like Steve Biko and the vilification of leaders such as Patrice Lumumba reflect the ongoing relevance of this archetype. These individuals, though not crucified in the literal sense, were subjected to forms of symbolic crucifixion through character assassination, imprisonment, and state-sanctioned violence. The stories of black messianic figures and their crucifixions resonate because they tap into universal themes of suffering, redemption, and the struggle against injustice. These narratives challenge us to confront the structures of power that perpetuate oppression and to reflect on the sacrifices made by those who dared to dream of a better world. In their lives and deaths, these figures embody the enduring relevance of the Passion narrative. Their crucifixions, literal or metaphorical, serve as a testament to the cost of challenging the status quo and a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. As we examine these stories, we are compelled to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that the forces that crucified Jesus of Nazareth continue to manifest in new and insidious ways, targeting those who dare to embody hope and resistance in a world still marred by injustice.